The stars had always been quiet. For most of human history, people looked up at the night sky and wondered if anyone was out there. They sent radio signals into the dark. They built giant listening dishes and pointed them at distant stars. They waited. For a long time, nothing answered. Then in the year 2079, everything changed. A small probe sent to the edge of the solar system picked up a weak signal. It was not from a natural source. It was not a pulsar or a dying star. It was structured, repeating, and clearly made by something intelligent. Within 72 hours, every major government on Earth knew about it. Within a week, the world knew. Humanity was not alone. The next decade was chaotic. Governments argued, scientists translated, diplomats practiced speaking into the void. And slowly, carefully, the first conversations began between Earth and the wider galaxy. What humanity found out there was not what the old science fiction movies had promised. There were no friendly aliens with glowing fingers offering peace and wisdom. The galaxy was old, complicated, and deeply political. There were hundreds of civilizations out among the stars, and most of them had been watching Earth for a long time without saying a word. The group that finally made contact was called the Galactic Conclave. It was a council of over 200 alien species, spread across thousands of star systems. Some of them had been traveling between stars for millions of years. Some had technology that made human science look like cave paintings. They were polite, organized, and very clear about one thing. Humanity was new, humanity was small, and humanity should be grateful just to have a seat at the table. Earth accepted the terms. Humanity joined the conclave as a junior member, which meant they had the right to speak, but not the right to vote on anything important. They were given access to basic star maps, basic trade routes, and very basic medical technology. The conclave kept its most advanced knowledge locked away, reserved for older and more trusted species. Still, humanity moved fast. By 2120, humans had built their first real starships. By 2140, they had small colonies on 3 planets outside the solar system. By 2187, there were over 40 million humans living among the stars, spread across Mars, the asteroid belt, several moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and 3 colony worlds in nearby star systems. The conclave still called them the young ones. Most alien species found humans to be strange. They were too emotional. They made decisions based on feelings and not just logic. They laughed at things that weren't funny. They cried at things that didn't matter. They got attached to objects and animals and places. They named their ships after dead people and old myths. They seemed to carry the weight of their entire history on their shoulders at all times. But they were also productive, harder working than many older species expected, and they were very, very good at learning. Admiral Serena Voss was one of the best examples of what humanity could produce when it tried. She was 53 years old, with short gray hair and eyes that always looked like they were calculating something. She had spent 30 years in the United Earth Defense Command, in which everyone simply called the UEDC. She had fought in 2 small border conflicts near the outer colonies. She had negotiated with alien merchants, alien pirates, and alien government officials who thought humans were barely worth their time. She had never once backed down from anything. On a cold Tuesday morning in March of 2187, our Admiral Voss was sitting in her office aboard the UEDC command station orbiting Earth when her communications officer knocked on the door and came in with a look on his face that she had never seen before. His name was Lieutenant Yusuf Marin, and he was 26 years old and normally very calm. Right now, he looked like he had seen a ghost. She told him to sit down and talk. He placed a data tablet on her desk. On it was a readout from the Oort Cloud Listening Network, a system of deep space sensors that humanity had built quietly over the past 30 years along the very outer edge of the solar system. The network was not advertised to the conclave. Most of its existence was classified. The readout showed an energy signature, a massive one, moving at nearly 40% of the speed of light, coming from the direction of the outer veil, which was a region of space past the known conclave territories where very few civilizations lived. Vossi studied the data for a long time without speaking. Then she asked him what the formation looked like. He told her. The signature wasn't one ship. It wasn't a fleet of 10 or 20. The formation analysis showed a spread consistent with thousands of individual vessels moving in a coordinated military advance pattern. The computer had been running calculations for 3 hours before Marn brought it to her because it kept rejecting the results as too large to be realistic. Worse, the estimate was 14,000 ships. Voss leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she picked up her secure communicator and made 3 calls in rapid succession. The first was to the UEDC Joint Chiefs. The second was to the Earth Council, which was the unified governing body of all human worlds. The third was to the Conclave Liaison Office. Within 6 hours, the data had been confirmed by 3 separate sensor networks. The signature was real. The fleet was real, and based on its heading, speed, and trajectory, it was aimed directly at the solar system. Humanity had a visitor coming. The problem was that this visitor had not sent any greetings. The Conclave Liaison, a tall, thin being from a species called the Vereth, arrived at the UEDC command station the following morning. Its name was Ambassador Sear, and it had always been one of the more respectful alien diplomats in dealing with humans. It walked into the briefing room. Hossa looked at the data spread across the wall screens and was quiet for a very long time. Then it said something that made the room go cold. It said it recognized the formation. The fleet belonged to a civilization called the Krethnar. They were an old empire, nearly 1,000 years of deep space travel behind them. They were not members of the Conclave. They had been offered membership several times and had refused every time, because the Krethnar did not believe in councils or agreements. They believed in one thing only: dominance. In the past 600 years, the Krethnar had attacked and destroyed 23 civilizations, not defeated them, not conquered and enslaved them, destroyed them. Every city, every ship, every colony, every living member of those species, gone. The Krethnar called it cataloging. They would study a species first, learn everything about them, and then eliminate them completely, keeping only their data in a massive archive aboard their flagship. 23 species extinct, cataloged. The Conclave had never stopped them because the Krethnar were powerful enough that any direct war would cost thousands of ships and hundreds of billions of lives. So the Conclave watched and shuddered and quietly moved their own populations away from the paths the Krethnar traveled. And now the Krethnar were coming to Earth. Ambassador Sear delivered the Conclave's official recommendation with a tone that was clearly uncomfortable. The Conclave advised humanity to begin the immediate evacuation of the solar system. They would open temporary refugee corridors to 3 Conclave worlds where humans could settle while alternative arrangements were discussed. The Conclave would formally protest the Krethnar advance through diplomatic channels. The Admiral asked if those diplomatic channels had ever worked before. Ambassador Sear was quiet for a moment. Then it said no. Voss thanked the ambassador for the information and escorted it out of the briefing room. Then she closed the door, turned to her officers, and told them to start preparing. Not for evacuation, for everything else. Over the next 12 hours, the Earth Council met an emergency session. Every head of government from every human world was connected through secure channels. The meeting lasted 9 hours. There were arguments. There were moments of fear. A few voices called for the evacuation plan, was saying that survival was more important than pride. But the majority did not agree. Because the truth was this: if humanity ran, they would have nothing to come back to. The Krethnar did not leave things behind. They cataloged, they erased. There would be no Earth to return to, no solar system to rebuild in. The colonies in other star systems were small and fragile, and could not support all of humanity permanently. Running was not survival. Running was a slower kind of extinction. And so the vote was taken. Humanity would not run. The decision was made quietly. No speeches were broadcast to the public. No dramatic declarations were sent to the Conclave. The governments of every human world simply began to move, coordinating through secure UEDC channels in ways that the wider galaxy never saw. The Conclave watched and waited for the evacuation ships to begin launching. None did. 3 days after the initial detection, a second piece of information arrived that made everything more real. One of the long-range sensor buoys in the Oort Cloud network had managed to intercept a tight beam transmission from the Krethnar fleet. It was a short message, clearly a standard advance notice that the Krethnar sent before they arrived at any target. It had been decoded by the UEDC translation team in under 4 hours. partly because human linguists had spent years studying the few fragments of Krethnar communication that had ever been recorded. The message was simple. It said, "Earth will be cataloged, then silenced." When Voss read the decoded message, she printed it on a piece of paper, which was an odd thing to do in 2187, but she had always liked paper. She folded it in half and put it in the front pocket of her uniform jacket, where she would keep it for the next 11 months. Not out of fear, she hid her out of focus, because when the hardest moments came, and she knew they were coming, she wanted to be able to reach into her pocket and remember exactly what was at stake. The Krethnar fleet was still months away. At its current speed, the best estimates placed its arrival at the outer edge of the solar system at approximately 11 months and 2 weeks from now. That was not a lot of time, but it was something. Humanity had always been very good at using the time it had. Voss called a second senior staff meeting the morning after the decoded message arrived. She stood at the head of the table and looked at the faces of her officers, people she had served with for years, people who were clearly frightened but were doing a very professional job of not showing it. And she told them something that only a handful of people in the entire galaxy knew. She told them that humanity had not spent the last 40 years doing nothing. She told them that there was a program. She told them its name, Project Longwall. The officers in the room who already knew the name kept their faces very still. The ones who were hearing it for the first time looked confused for a moment, then uncertain. Then something shifted in their eyes as she began to explain. The confusion faded. The uncertainty faded. What replaced it was hard to describe exactly. It was not quite confidence. It was not quite relief. It was something more like recognition. The feeling of understanding, for the first time, that the ground beneath your feet was not as thin as you thought. Outside, across the solar system, the planets continued to turn. On Earth, cities went about their business. People went to work, raised families, watched entertainment feeds, argued about politics. Most of them did not know what was coming. The governments had decided to manage the information carefully, to avoid panic, to keep daily life as stable as possible, while the preparations moved forward. And among the stars, moving at impossible speed through the dark, the Krethnar fleet crossed another 1 billion kilometers of space, 14,000 ships, coming for a planet they had already decided to silence. They had done this 23 times before. They had never once been surprised. They had never once failed. But this time, something was different. This time, the target had known they were coming and had been getting ready for a very long time. Yet in the Conclave's Grand Diplomatic Hall, 3 star systems away, Ambassador Sear filed its report on the situation and included one detail that it could not fully explain. When it had been in the UEDC briefing room and had told the human admiral that the evacuation was recommended, the admiral had not looked frightened. She had looked like someone who had just been handed a reason to use something she had been building for years. Sear had served as a diplomat for over a century. It had watched species face extinction-level threats. It knew what fear looked like on 100 different kinds of faces. What it had seen on Admiral Voss's face was not fear. It wrote that detail in its report, underlined it, and then sent an additional private message to its own government that was not part of the official report. The message said only 5 words. "I think we misjudged them." The name Project Longwall had existed in classified UEDC files for 41 years. It had been started in the year 2146, just a few years after humanity made its first contact with the Galactic Conclave. At the time, most people on Earth were celebrating. The discovery of alien life, of a whole galaxy full of civilizations, felt like the beginning of something wonderful. Politicians gave speeches about a new era of cooperation. Scientists talked about all the knowledge that would be shared. People looked up at the stars with something new in their hearts. But not everyone felt that way. A small group of UEDC officers and defense analysts had looked at the conclave data differently. They had read the history files that came with first contact, the quiet records of wars, extinctions, collapsed civilizations, entire species gone from the galaxy. They had seen that the conclave was not a family. It was a collection of powerful groups who cooperated when it suited them and looked away when it didn't. And they had seen the Krethnar. In the file on the Krethnar was not long, but it was enough. 23 civilizations, 600 years of recorded destruction, a pattern that never changed. The Krethnar moved, they cataloged, they silenced. These analysts and officers wrote a report. It was classified at the highest level. It went to a small group of Earth Council members who read it, went pale, and then made a decision that they would keep secret from the general public. From the conclave, and from almost everyone in the UEDC itself. They decided that humanity would prepare, not visibly, not in a way that would alarm the conclave or invite attention from the Krethnar or any other dangerous power. Quietly, carefully, over decades, they would build something. A defense that no one could see coming, a wall standing in the dark, invisible until the moment it was needed. They called it Long Wall because the best walls were the ones that never let anything through. For 41 years, the program ran in secret. It was funded through a dozen layers of budget disguise, hidden inside research grants and infrastructure projects and exploration programs. The people who worked on it were carefully selected and deeply trusted. They lived normal professional lives in the UEDC, while also in secure facilities that didn't officially exist, contributing to the most ambitious military construction project in human history. By the time Admiral Voss stood in that briefing room and said the name to her officers, Project Longwall had produced three things. The first was the Ragnarok platforms. There were 300 of them, scattered throughout the Kuiper Belt, which was the wide band of frozen rock and ice beyond Neptune at the edge of the solar system. Each platform was roughly the size of a small city, built around a frame of dense asteroid material that made them nearly impossible to detect against the natural background of the belt. They had been constructed piece by piece over 15 years and then assembled in place, camouflaged against the rock and ice around them. Each platform carried two weapon systems. The first was a relativistic mass driver, a magnetic acceleration cannon so powerful that it could take a dense metal projectile and push it to 70% of the speed of light. At that speed, a projectile the size of a small car carried the energy of a nuclear weapon. The physics were simple and brutal. Mass times velocity. At 70% of the speed of light, even a small object hit with the force of a small star. There was no shield technology in the known galaxy rated for a direct hit from a relativistic round. The Conclave had treaties against building such weapons because they were considered too dangerous and too indiscriminate. Why humanity had built 300 of them. The second weapon on each platform was an antimatter beam array. This was more precise and shorter range, designed to cut through hull armor at close distances. Less dramatic than the mass drivers, but faster to aim, faster to fire, and able to cycle through targets very quickly. Together, a single Ragnarok platform could threaten a small fleet on its own. 300 of them, firing simultaneously from the Kuiper Belt into an advancing enemy formation, would create a wall of destruction that nothing could push through without catastrophic losses. The second achievement of Project Longwall was the Ghost Fleet. Human ships that the Conclave and the wider galaxy knew about were modest, well-built, reasonably fast, equipped with decent weapons and shields. Nobody was afraid of human warships. They were considered adequate for patrol work, colonial defense, countering small-scale conflicts. The Ghost Fleet was something different. It consisted of 4,000 warships, and not a single one of them had ever appeared on a UEDC public registry. They did not exist in any file that the Conclave had access to. They had been built in secret dry docks hidden inside large asteroids in the outer belt, using a construction technique that produced almost no detectable emissions. But the most important thing about the Ghost Fleet was not its size or its weapons. It was how the ships became invisible. Human physicists, working in complete secrecy for 20 years, had developed what they called dark drive technology. The principle was complex, but the result was simple. A ship running on dark drive became effectively invisible to every known sensor technology, Conclave, Krethnar, or otherwise. It did not just reduce its signature, it genuinely vanished from detection. The ships became dark holes in space that no scanner could find. When this had required solving 3 separate problems in quantum field physics that the Conclave's best scientists had declared unsolvable. Human researchers had solved all 3. In testing, Conclave sensor ships had passed within 1,000 kilometers of Ghost Fleet vessels running dark drives and detected nothing. Not even residual heat, not even gravity variations. 4,000 invisible warships, armed and trained, waiting in the dark. China, the third achievement of Project Longwall, was the most quietly terrifying of the three. It was called the Shepard Protocol. Shepard was an artificial intelligence, but not the kind of AI that most people imagined when they heard the term. It was not a computer answering questions or running simulations. It was a deep strategic system that had been running continuously for 30 years, processing every piece of military and intelligence data that humanity could gather about the alien species in the galaxy. Most of that data had been gathered covertly. Human intelligence operatives working through conclave diplomatic channels had spent decades quietly collecting information. Battle records, fleet doctrine files, tactical analysis reports, historical accounts of alien military engagements, communication intercepts from dozens of species. Some of the most valuable data had come from the Conclave's own archives, which humanity was not officially authorized to access at the level of detail they needed. The methods used to obtain it were things that nobody wrote down. For 30 years, Shepard had consumed all of this data and done one thing with it. It had learned. It had learned how alien militaries thought, how they planned, how they reacted under pressure, what decisions their commanders made at different stages of a battle, what formations they preferred, what their standard responses to ambush were, what they did when they were losing, and what they did when they thought they were winning, and Shepard had studied the Krethnar more than any other species. 600 years of Krethnar military history lived inside Shepard's databanks. Every battle it had records on, every fleet engagement, every planetary assault, every tactical decision made by every Krethnar commander in the historical record. Shepard could predict, with a high degree of accuracy, what the Krethnar fleet would do in almost any scenario. Not perfectly. War was never perfect, but well enough to plan against. Well enough to set traps that their doctrine would lead them into. Well enough to be one step ahead. Admiral Voss had spent 3 months working with Shepard before the Krethnar were ever detected, running through various invasion scenarios as part of standard contingency planning. She knew the system well. She trusted it the way a chess player trusts a grandmaster coach. Not to fight the battle for her, but to tell her what the other side was likely to do next. Now she was going to need everything Shepard knew. The 11 months between the initial detection and the estimated arrival of the Krethnar fleet became the most intense period of preparation in human history. The Ghost Fleet was moved, its 4,000 ships repositioned in complete silence across the outer solar system, using dark drives to remain invisible while taking up carefully calculated positions inside and along the edges of what Shepard had designated as the most likely approach vector of the Krethnar advance. Some ships moved deep into space along the fleet's expected path, days of travel ahead of where they would be needed, waiting in perfect stillness and perfect darkness. 200 Ghost Fleet captains were given the same basic instruction. Find your coordinates. Move there. We'll shut down everything that isn't life support. Wait. Do not transmit. Do not move. Do not give any sign that you exist. They followed the instruction without question. The Ragnarok platforms were checked, serviced, and armed. Each one ran a full diagnostic cycle. Ammunition stores, if you could call relativistic metal rounds ammunition, were verified and ready. Targeting systems were updated with Shepard's latest models. E-power systems were pushed to peak capacity and held there in standby mode. 300 platforms, cold and dark in the Kuiper Belt, holding their breath. Meanwhile, the visible UEDC fleet, the ships the Conclave knew about, the ships on the public registry, was positioned in ways that made sense for a civilization attempting a defensive last stand. Patrol ships near the outer planets, a small group of destroyers near Jupiter, some orbital defense platforms around Earth. Nothing special. Nothing that would make a Krethnar advanced scout worried. That was intentional. Because 9 months into the 11-month countdown, one of the Oort cloud sensor buoys detected something small and fast crossing the outer edge of the solar system. It was moving very quickly and trying very hard to be quiet. It was a Krethnar scout probe, a small automated device sent ahead of the main fleet to gather targeting data. Shepard had predicted it would come. He had predicted the exact window within which it would likely arrive, had recommended that it be allowed to enter the solar system, gather data, and transmit back. What it would see was the visible UEDC fleet, the normal patrol ships, the outer planet defenses, nothing hidden, nothing threatening. What it would not see, because there was nothing to see, was the Ghost Fleet or the Ragnarok platforms. The probe traveled into the solar system, spent 4 seconds gathering data, and began transmitting back to the Krethnar fleet. It had been transmitting for 4.3 seconds when a single, precisely aimed railgun, round from a hidden Ghost Fleet ship, shredded it into dust. The transmission was incomplete. The Krethnar fleet received a partial signal from its scout probe before it went dead. In the Krethnar fleet's command structure, a junior intelligence officer filed a report noting that the scout probe had been destroyed, likely by a human defensive weapon, and that the signal had been cut short before full data transfer. The officer recommended sending a second probe. The Krethnar Grand Admiral, a being named Thovek, reviewed the report and made a different decision. Probe destruction was normal. Enemy defenses usually tried to eliminate scouts. The partial signal had shown what was expected: a modest, inadequate human defense. Nothing worth changing the battle plan over. The plan would proceed as designed. Narada Thovek had run this exact operation 23 times. He had never changed his battle plan based on a destroyed probe. He was not going to start now. This decision would define everything that came after. Back at UEDC Command, the destruction of the Krethnar probe was reported to Admiral Voss. She listened to the account, confirmed that the transmission had been cut at 4.3 seconds, and then asked Shepard to model what the Krethnar High Command was most likely to conclude from the incomplete signal. Shepard's answer was quick and confident. They would conclude their defenses were adequate. They would not change the approach formation. They would advance as planned. Voss looked at the holographic display of the solar system above her command table. 14,000 ships coming from deep space. 10 weeks away now, every piece of her preparation in place. The Ragnarok platform sitting cold and silent in the Kuiper Belt. The Ghost Fleet invisible and waiting along the approach path. Shepard running through its final battle models, updating probability estimates, refining the coordinates of the trap she had spent months designing. She thought about the 23 species the Krethnar had destroyed. She thought about the message in her front pocket. Earth will be cataloged, or then silenced. She thought about 8 billion people on Earth who were going about their lives right now, not knowing what was coming, trusting without knowing it that someone was standing between them and the dark. Then she turned to her senior staff and told them that in 10 weeks, when the Krethnar fleet crossed the heliopause and entered the solar system, they were going to walk into the most complete trap ever built by any civilization in the history of the galaxy, and they were never going to see it coming. One of her officers, a young captain named Dara Wells, who was 29 and had joined the UEDC straight out of university and had never seen a real battle, raised her hand and asked one question. She asked what they should do if something went wrong. Voss looked at her for a moment. Then she said that they would figure it out, because that was what humans did. In the conclave diplomatic halls 3 star systems away, when Ambassador Sear was watching the situation reports and noting with growing confusion that humanity still had not launched a single evacuation ship. Not one colony transport had moved toward the refugee corridors the conclave had opened. The humans were just sitting there, waiting. For what, Sear could not fully understand. But the feeling it had first felt in that UEDC briefing room had not gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger. Something was hidden here. See, something the humans had never shown anyone. And in 8 weeks, whatever it was, the whole galaxy was going to see it for the first time. The Krethnar fleet dropped out of transit drive at 0300 hours, Earth Standard Time. One moment, the outer edge of the solar system was quiet and dark. The next moment, 14,000 ships appeared from nowhere, snapping into real space with a burst of energy that lit up every sensor buoy in the Oort cloud network. And the signal reached UEDC command station within seconds. Admiral Voss was already awake. She had been awake for 20 hours straight, working through the final preparation checks, reviewing Shepard's last round of battle models, walking the corridors of the station and speaking to her people. She had slept for 3 hours in the early part of the previous day and decided that 3 hours was enough for now. When Lieutenant Marin appeared in the doorway of the command center and said the words she had been waiting 11 months to hear, she simply nodded, set down her coffee, and walked to her station. "They're here," she said to the room. The command center went very still for 1 second. Then everyone moved at once. On the holographic table at the center of the room, the solar system map updated in real time. 14,000 contacts appeared along the outer edge, their positions marked in red, and their projected course lines stretching inward like long red fingers, reaching toward the inner planets, toward Earth. Voss studied the formation for a long moment. It was textbook Krethnar. She had seen this exact spread in Shepard's historical files a dozen times. They entered in a wide fan formation, spreading their ships across a broad front so that no single defensive position could engage more than a fraction of the fleet at once. The front wave would draw fire and identify defensive emplacements. The second and third waves would overwhelm those positions. The fourth wave would advance toward the primary target. They had used this formation in 23 previous attacks. It had worked every time. Shepard had been built specifically around this formation. Voss looked at the projected approach vector. The fleet was moving at combat advanced speed now, slower than their transit drive, but still fast. Based on current speed and heading, they would reach the Kuiper Belt in approximately 6 hours. She watched the red contacts on the display for another moment, making sure their formation matched what Shepard had predicted. It matched exactly. She pressed the command key that activated the longwall network. Deep in the Kuiper Belt, 300 Ragnarok platforms received their activation signal and began powering up from standby mode. The process was slow and careful, designed to minimize any energy signature that might be detectable. Each platform went through its startup sequence in a staggered pattern, spread across a 6-hour window so that the gradual increase in power across the belt looked to any distant sensor like nothing more than the natural thermal variation of the frozen rock around it. Simultaneously, the Ghost Fleet received its first movement orders. 4,000 ships, already positioned along the Krethnar approach vector, which began to very slowly and very carefully adjust their positions. No engine burns longer than 3 seconds. No course corrections that would produce a detectable trail. Each ship moved like a ghost, which was exactly what they were supposed to be, drifting silently into their final assigned positions. Some of those positions were inside the Krethnar formation itself. This was the most daring part of the entire plan, and it was the part that had made even Shepard's probability models look uncertain when Voss first proposed it. Over the past 9 days, 62 Ghost Fleet warships had been running dark drives and moving, with extraordinary patience, into the space that the Krethnar fleet was going to occupy. They had been threading through the advance a little closer every day, timing their movement to coincide with moments when the Krethnar sensor sweeps were known to be directed elsewhere. By the time the main fleet arrived, these 62 ships were already mixed in among the outer formation, invisible and waiting, at ranges so close that their weapons would be nearly impossible to miss. The Krethnar had no idea they were there. The fleet continued to advance. 6 hours passed. The red contacts on the holographic display moved steadily inward. Ambassador Sear was watching from a secure conclave monitoring station linked to the UEDC network. It had been granted observer access at the last minute, more because Voss had wanted a witness than out of any diplomatic necessity. Sear sat in front of its screens and watched the Krethnar fleet advance and watched the UEDC command center, and said nothing because there was nothing to say. The conclave's diplomatic protest of the Krethnar advance had been filed. The response from the Krethnar High Command had been complete silence, as expected. Sear was watching because it needed to see what happened next, not for its government's files, for itself. Because in all its years as a diplomat, it had never seen anything like what was unfolding in this room. There was fear here, yes. It could see it in the young officers, in the tight set of their jaws and the careful way they breathed. But there was something else that Sear could not name. A collective mood, a shared certainty that lay underneath the fear like bedrock under thin soil. Well, these people were not acting like a civilization facing extinction. They were acting like people who had been waiting a long time for a specific moment and now knew it was finally here. At hours 6 and 40 minutes, the lead elements of the Krethnar fleet reached the outer boundary of the Kuiper Belt and stopped. It was only a brief stop, a standard formation check before entering a contested region. The Krethnar commanders studied their sensor readings, or they saw the Kuiper Belt ahead of them, dark and full of rock and ice, just as their maps showed. They saw the light scatter of the outer planets far ahead. They saw the distant warm star that was Earth's sun. They did not see 300 Ragnarok platforms sitting cold and silent among the rocks. Grand Admiral Thovek gave the order to advance into the Kuiper Belt. The fleet moved. For 3 more hours, 14,000 Krethnar ships pushed through the outer reaches of the solar system. This was the longest part for the humans waiting. The silence on the command deck was the kind that presses against your ears. Officers checked their stations without being asked. Nobody spoke unless they had something specific to report. Voss stood at the holographic table with her hands flat on the surface and watched the red contacts move. She watched the numbers: distance, formation, density, heading, speed. She watched and she waited, and she held the image of those 300 platforms in her mind. Dark and still among the rocks, full of power that had been building for decades, waiting for one word. At hour 9 and 52 minutes, the Krethnar fleet reached the coordinate that Shepard had identified 6 months earlier. It was a point in space between the Kuiper Belt and the orbit of Neptune, where the formation density of the advancing fleet would be at its highest and where the angles from the Ragnarok platforms were optimal for maximum coverage. Shepard had a name for it in its tactical files: the kill box. Voss looked at the display one more time. Every contact exactly where Shepard had said they would be. The Ghost fleet invisible among and around the formation, weapons locked and ready. The Ragnarok platforms powered and aimed, waiting for the activation signal that had been pre-programmed into them since the day they were built. She pressed the open channel key for the UEDC command frequency. She said one word: Shepard. The word went out across the secure network and reached every UEDC ship and every Ragnarok platform in a fraction of a second. What happened next happened so fast and from so many directions that even the recordings would take analysts weeks to fully understand. 300 Ragnarok platforms fired simultaneously. The Kuiper Belt lit up. It did not look like a battle beginning. It looked like the edge of the solar system had suddenly caught fire. 300 mass drivers, each accelerating projectiles to 70% of the speed of light, opened fire at pre-calculated targets across the Krethnar formation. Thousands of rounds in the first second alone, moving at a speed that made evasion impossible. Moving so fast that by the time a Krethnar sensor registered the launch signature of a round, the round had already arrived. At the same moment, 62 Ghost Fleet ships inside the Krethnar formation dropped their dark drives and opened fire at point-blank range. Their targets were the Krethnar command ships, communications relays, and formation anchor vessels. Exactly the ships that Shepard had identified as critical to the coordination of the fleet's tactical response. From outside the formation, 4,000 Ghost Fleet ships decloaked along the approach flanks and began their attack runs. In the first 80 seconds of the engagement, 612 Krethnar vessels were destroyed or critically damaged. The Krethnar fleet, which had advanced in perfect textbook formation, suddenly had fire coming at it from 3 directions at once, including from inside its own formation, from weapons that nobody had ever told them existed, using technology that their science had not believed was possible. On the Krethnar flagship, Grand Admiral Thovek received damage reports that arrived so quickly they overwhelmed his command systems. His formation was breaking. Ships were being destroyed faster than his fleet command network could track. His communication ships were gone. His sensor arrays were reading ghost signals in every direction. His advanced formation was folding as captains tried to maneuver away from fire that was coming from angles that made no sense. He was, for the first time in 300 years of military command, not sure what to do. He had never been ambushed before. No one had ever surprised him. Every civilization he had approached had either tried to run or had come out to fight in the open, offering their ships to be destroyed cleanly. No one had ever been inside his formation without him knowing. No one had ever had hidden weapons the size of cities sitting in an asteroid field waiting for him. For 312 seconds, Thovek did nothing but absorb information and try to understand what was happening. Then he recovered, because whatever else the Krethnar were, they were experienced soldiers. And experienced soldiers, even when surprised, still fight. Thovek began issuing orders. If he pulled the formation back from the kill box, sacrificing the forward elements to buy space for the rear sections to reform, he directed his surviving command ships to begin sensor sweeps to locate the source of the mass driver fire. He ordered his heaviest warships to concentrate fire on the closest Ghost Fleet vessels, trying to tear holes in the encircling attack. And he ordered 400 ships, his fastest, his most heavily armed, to break out of the engagement entirely and make a direct run for the inner solar system, for Earth. Because the Krethnar doctrine was clear on one point above all others. When facing an unexpected defense, the fastest way to break it was to threaten the thing it was defending. No civilization had ever been willing to let its homeworld burn to win a battle at the edge of its solar system. Thovek assumed humans would be the same. In the UEDC command center, Shepard flagged the breakout attempt before the ships had accelerated to attack speed. The alert was on Voss's screen within seconds. She looked at the projected course. 400 ships burning hard for Earth. They would pass through the outer planets in 3 hours at current acceleration. She looked at her available forces. The Ghost Fleet was fully committed to the main engagement. The Ragnarok platforms were cycling between targets across the main formation, because she had reserves. The visible UEDC fleet that had been positioned as the decoy defensive line, but they were not positioned to intercept 400 Krethnar warships and survive it. Someone was going to have to go and meet them. She looked at her command display and found the ship identifier she was looking for. It was tagged far to one side of the main engagement, a UEDC destroyer group of 11 ships that had been held back from the initial attack specifically for this possibility. And their commander was a man she had known for 12 years. His name was Commander Hiro Tanaka, and he was 44 years old and very good at the kind of impossible things that came up in battles. She opened a direct channel to his ship. She told him what was coming. She told him what she needed. There was a pause on the line, not a long one. Then Tanaka said he understood. In the monitoring station, Ambassador Sear watched the tactical display with something that felt like it was dissolving its certainty of decades of understanding. It had watched hundreds of military conflicts from a diplomatic distance. It knew how battles looked. It knew the patterns, the escalation, the breakdown, the point at which one side realized it had lost and the negotiations began. This looked like nothing it had ever seen. The humans had not just defended, they had engineered this, every piece of it. Oh, the positions, the timing, the way the Krethnar had been led into exactly the right spot before the trap closed. It was not just courage. It was preparation so deep and so patient that it had apparently been invisible for 4 decades. Sear found itself thinking about the 23 civilizations the Krethnar had destroyed. Species that had not known this was coming, species that had not had 40 years to quietly, invisibly build something like this in the dark. It thought about all the times the Conclave had called humans the young ones. On its screen, the battle was still raging. 600 Krethnar ships gone in the first 90 seconds, and more going dark every minute. The Ghost Fleet was fighting hard. The Ragnarok platforms were firing in steady rotation, wave after wave of relativistic rounds hitting the Krethnar rear formation. And somewhere in the middle of it all, on what 11 human destroyers were turning to meet 400 Krethnar warships. Sear stared at the screen for a long time. Then it sent a message to the Conclave Grand Assembly that contained no analysis and no diplomatic language. It just said, "Watch this." Commander Hiro Tanaka had 11 ships. They were not the biggest ships in the UEDC fleet. They were not the most heavily armed. They were a destroyer group, fast, maneuverable, built for quick strikes and tactical flexibility rather than prolonged heavy engagement. In a straight fight against 400 Krethnar warships, they would be destroyed in minutes. Tanaka knew this. He sat in the command chair of his flagship, the UEDC destroyer Makara, and looked at the tactical display as his ships formed up and oriented themselves toward the incoming Krethnar breakout group. 400 red contacts, accelerating hard, weapons charging. The sensor readouts told him everything he needed to know, and none of it was good. He had been given a job. Admiral Voss had told him what she needed with the clear and simple honesty that had always been one of the things he respected most about her. She needed those 400 ships slowed down long enough for the Ragnarok platforms to retarget and open fire on the breakout group. The platforms were committed to the main engagement, cycling their targeting arrays from several thousand contacts across a wide formation to a concentrated group of 400 moving in a different direction would take time. She needed him to buy that time. He asked how long. She said 40 minutes. He said he understood. He did not tell his crew what the full tactical picture looked like. There was no point. They were professional soldiers. They could see the numbers as well as he could. What mattered now was not the math. And what mattered was that they did their job while they still could. He ordered the Makara and her 10 companion ships to maximum burn. The Kreth-Nar breakout group saw the 11 ships coming, and for a moment, Tanaka imagined he could almost feel the confusion on the other side. 11 ships against 400. It made no sense. In Kreth-Nar tactical doctrine, a force that small would not attack a force that large. It would break off, evade, or simply die quickly and be recorded as a minor obstacle. But Tanaka did not attack the formation. He did something different. He drove his 11 ships straight into the center of the Kreth-Nar column at maximum speed, weapons firing in every direction, each ship choosing independent targets and engaging with everything it had. Lasers, missiles, close-range rail rounds, even the emergency point defense cannons that were normally only used against incoming fire. Every weapon on every ship, it all at once, screaming forward into 400 enemies. It was not a coordinated assault, it was chaos, and chaos was the point. In Kreth-Nar doctrine, a charging enemy force attacked in formation. Commanders on the other side would be trained to respond to organized attacks. What they were not trained for, because no enemy had ever been irrational enough to do it, was 11 ships going completely berserk in the middle of their column. Ships had to break formation to avoid collision. The ships in the rear had to hold fire to avoid hitting their own vessels in the confusion. The advance slowed, not because 11 destroyers were powerful enough to stop 400 warships, but because 400 warships suddenly had a problem they couldn't easily solve without stopping to deal with it. 3 of Tanaka's ships were destroyed in the first 4 minutes. 2 more were crippled and fell out of the engagement. Their crews tried to maintain fire from disabled positions, still shooting at anything within range. Tanaka's own ship took 3 direct hits in the first 10 minutes. His engineering section reported hull breaches on 2 decks. His main weapons array was down to 60% capacity. His navigator had been injured and replaced by the backup officer. He kept going, because 40 minutes was 40 minutes. On the main engagement front, the battle was changing. The Kreth-Nar had recovered from the initial shock with the discipline of a military that had 600 years of war behind it. Their formation, shattered in the first moments of the engagement, had begun to pull itself back into something functional. Their heavy warships, the big powerful vessels that formed the backbone of the Kreth-Nar fleet, had pushed to the outer edges of the Ghost Fleet's encirclement and were fighting with everything they had, trying to break out of the trap. Now some of them were succeeding. Ghost Fleet captains were dying for it. The engagement had turned from a clean ambush into a grinding, brutal close-range fight where skill and ferocity mattered as much as positioning. Human ships that had been designed for hit-and-run tactics were now locked in dogfights with Kreth-Nar warships that were bigger, tougher, and loaded with weapons that could crack a destroyer in half with a single hit. The Ghost Fleet was winning, but it was not winning easily. Captain Yara Osei, commanding the Ghost Fleet destroyer Sundial, fought 3 separate Kreth-Nar warships in sequence over 90 minutes, each engagement at ranges so close that her crew could theoretically have seen the enemy's ships through their observation ports. She lost half her weapons array in the second engagement. She fought the third with 1 engine offline and 3 of her 6 weapon systems jury-rigged to run off backup power. She survived all 3. Lieutenant Commander Reza Farsi, aboard the stealth cruiser Persistence, spent 40 minutes dodging a Kreth-Nar heavy gunship that was twice his ship's size. He couldn't outrun it and couldn't outgun it. He led it into a region of the Kuiper Belt where the asteroid density was higher, threading through gaps in the rock at speeds that his navigation officer kept telling him were too fast to safely manage. The Kreth-Nar gunship following him clipped a large asteroid at combat speed and broke apart. Farsi's navigation officer, who had told him 3 times that the speed was too high, looked over at him when it was over. He shrugged. She laughed, which surprised both of them. Across hundreds of engagements spread across a vast region of space, this was how the battle was being won. Not through any single dramatic moment, but through thousands of individual acts of skill and stubbornness and problem-solving. Human crews refusing to accept that the situation was worse than it was, and finding ways through things that weren't supposed to be survivable. Back at the Tanaka engagement, the clock read 38 minutes. Tanaka had 3 ships left that could still fight. His own ship, damaged but moving. 2 others, battered and running on reduced power, but still throwing weapons fire. The remaining ships of his group were either destroyed or too heavily damaged to maneuver. The Krethnar column had pushed through despite everything, and was gaining speed again. But they were 38 minutes behind where they would have been. The Ragnarok platforms had retargeted. The first wave of relativistic rounds hit the Krethnar breakout group from 3 different platforms simultaneously, and the effect was immediate and catastrophic. Ships that had no warning, no time to maneuver, no defense against objects traveling at 70% of the speed of light, must simply cease to exist in flashes of energy that briefly outshone the distant sun. 40 ships destroyed in the first 8 seconds, then 60 more as the second wave arrived, then another 40. The Krethnar breakout attempt collapsed. Tanaka, watching from his damaged bridge, saw the red contacts on his display disappearing in clusters. He let out a breath that he had been holding for almost 40 minutes and told his remaining crew that they could stand down from full combat alert. Sunrun, nobody cheered. They were too tired for that. But the tension in the room released like air from a punctured balloon, and several people leaned back in their stations and closed their eyes for a moment. The main battle continued for another 11 hours. The Krethnar fought with everything they had. There was nothing in their history that had prepared them for this, but they were not a species that surrendered easily, and Grand Admiral Thovek was not going to go quietly. He tried everything his military doctrine had to offer. He attempted a concentrated breakthrough at the Ghost Fleet's northern engagement line, massing 300 of his heaviest warships in a single push. Shepard had modeled this exact maneuver and had pre-positioned 4 Ragnarok platforms specifically for it. The breakthrough attempt cost the Krethnar 200 ships in 20 minutes and gained them nothing. He tried dispersing his fleet into small groups, hoping to overwhelm the Ghost Fleet's targeting by presenting too many individual contacts to engage at once. Shepard had modeled this too. Human ships followed individual groups with precision, and the Ragnarok platforms switched to what their targeting systems called area denial mode, filling zones of space with enough relativistic fire that nothing could move through them safely. He tried falling back, attempting to create distance from the Kuiper Belt and the mass driver fire. The Ghost Fleet followed, and when his rear formation turned to fight the pursuit, they found themselves in a crossfire between the pursuing ships and reserve Ghost Fleet units that had been waiting specifically for a retreat scenario. Shepard had modeled everything. At hour 17, Thovek had fewer than 4,000 ships left. He was being pressed from all sides. The kill box had expanded to cover nearly half the outer solar system, and there was no direction he could move that didn't lead into fire. His communication network was still functional, but only barely. His heavy warships were taking damage faster than his repair crews could manage. He looked at the battle data for a very long time. Then he did something that no Krethnar military commander had done in recorded history. He opened a communication channel to the UEDC command frequency. In the UEDC command center, the alert for an incoming Krethnar transmission appeared on Lieutenant Marin's screen, and he stared at it for 3 full seconds before he believed it was real. Then he turned to Admiral Voss and told her. She looked at him. Then she looked at the display. Then she said to put it through. The translation came through Shepard's language system a fraction of a second after the transmission arrived, the words appearing in clear text on the main screen. To Grand Admiral Thovek requested terms of surrender. It was a simple statement. No explanation. No context. In Krethnar language, it was a short, direct formal declaration, and it said exactly what it needed to say in the minimum possible number of words. The Krethnar were not a species that elaborated. They said what was true and left it there. The room was silent. Nobody had known this was possible. Not because they hadn't hoped for it, But because nobody had any record of the Krethnar ever having done it before. In 600 years of warfare, across 23 civilizations, the Krethnar had never, not once, surrendered. Voss looked at the text on the screen for a long time. Outside, the battle was still running. Ghost Fleet ships were still in contact with the remaining Krethnar vessels. The Ragnarok platforms were still cycling. People were still fighting and dying in the dark beyond Neptune. She told the communications team to hold all offensive operations pending confirmation that the surrender request applied to the full fleet. Then she composed a response. It was short. It said that the UEDC would accept a full cessation of hostilities by the Krethnar fleet, conditional on immediate weapons cold across all vessels, formation hold at current positions, and direct communication from the fleet command to all individual captains ordering compliance. Whilst non-compliance by individual ships would be treated as a continuation of hostilities. She sent it. 7 minutes later, a second message came back. Compliance order transmitted to all Krethnar fleet elements, weapons standing cold. Across the outer solar system, the last exchanges of fire sputtered out like candles going dark one by one. Ghost Fleet ships held positions. Ragnarok platforms held their fire. The silence that fell over the engagement zone was the most profound silence that any human in the command center had ever heard in a battle. Marin looked at the current fleet count on his display. Of the 14,000 Krethnar ships that had entered the solar system, 9,042 had been destroyed, were critically damaged, or had lost all power. 3,100 were damaged but functional. The remaining 1,800 ships, including the flagship, were intact. All of them were holding position beyond Neptune, weapons cold, waiting for orders from their Grand Admiral. And across the galaxy, transmitted in real time through Sear's observation relay to the Conclave's main communication network, every species that had been watching the data feed saw the count. They saw how long the battle had lasted. They saw the numbers on both sides. They saw the weapons that humanity had built in secret. They saw the way the entire engagement had been designed and executed precisely according to a plan built over 4 decades. And then they saw the thing that would be talked about for generations. They saw a Krethnar Grand Admiral ask for mercy from the species he had come to silence. In the Conclave's Grand Assembly Hall, on a dozen different worlds, in trading stations and government buildings and military headquarters, across hundreds of star systems, beings of every shape and description sat in silence in front of their information screens. Some of them had been alive for thousands of years. Some of them had watched the Krethnar destroy civilizations they had known. Some of them had told humanity to run. Nobody said anything for a very long time. Then, in a government building on a planet called Veth Prime, on a Conclave senior council member who was 900 years old and had seen more of galactic history than almost any living being turned to the younger diplomat sitting beside her. She said one sentence. She said, "How long have they been capable of this?" The younger diplomat had no answer. Nobody in the galaxy did. In the days that followed the battle, the solar system was very quiet, not the quiet of emptiness or defeat, and the quiet of people who had been holding their breath for 11 months and had finally, very slowly, started to let it out. The news had reached the general public within hours of the surrender. There was no way to keep it contained. Too many people had seen the sensor feeds. Too many soldiers had sent messages home. Too many pieces of information had moved through channels too quickly for any government to manage. And so, in cities on Earth, on Mars, on the colony worlds in distant star systems, people found out at different moments in different ways that an alien armada had come for them and had not reached them. The reactions were different everywhere. On Earth, there were crowds in the streets. Some people cried. Some people cheered. In some cities, people did nothing, just stood outside their homes and looked up at the night sky with expressions that were hard to read, as if they were seeing something familiar in a completely new way. On Mars, the colony domes lit up with every decoration their residents could find. In the asteroid belt, miners who worked in deep silence for months at a stretch held quiet gatherings in their pressurized common rooms and raised whatever they had to drink. In the outer solar system, the surviving Krethnar fleet sat in a containment zone beyond Neptune. It had been moved there in the first 3 days after the surrender, each ship guided by Ghost Fleet escorts to designated holding positions, The weapons locked, shields down, all systems running under UEDC monitoring. The Krethnar did not resist. Their ships moved where they were directed and held where they were told to hold. Whatever their feelings were about the situation, they kept those feelings to themselves. The containment zone was not a prison in the traditional sense. There were no energy barriers. There were no force fields holding the ships in place. What held them there was the presence of Ghost Fleet vessels at every possible departure angle, and the knowledge, very fresh in every Krethnar officer's memory, of what the hidden weapons in the Kuiper Belt could do to a moving ship. Nobody tested it. Grand Admiral Thovek remained on his flagship, sending minimal communications and accepting the UEDC's logistical support for his crews. Food, water, medical supplies, without comment. He was 312 years old. He had commanded fleets since before most human nations had their current borders. He had never lost a campaign. He spent the first week of confinement writing reports. Not for the UEDC, not for anyone who had captured him. He wrote them for the Krethnar Imperial Command, detailed and honest accounts of everything that had happened, because in his culture, recording the truth of a defeat was considered more important than the pride that wanted to soften it. When his race had always believed that understanding why you lost was the only thing that made a loss worth surviving. He wrote about the weapons he hadn't known existed, the stealth technology his sensors had been completely blind to, the battle management system that had predicted his tactics with terrifying accuracy, the way the humans had fought, not like any other species he had encountered, without a clear doctrine that could be studied and countered, but with an adaptability and stubbornness that seemed to generate new responses to new problems faster than his commanders could keep up with. He wrote about the 11 destroyers. He wrote about that for a long time, because it was the thing he understood least and could not stop thinking about. 11 ships charging 400. No tactical logic in it. No survival mathematics that made sense. And yet those 11 ships had bought enough time to let the platform weapons retarget, and without that time, the breakout would have succeeded, and Earth's inner system would have been threatened. He wrote, they sent 11 ships against 400, not because 11 ships can stop 400, but because someone decided that the time those 11 ships could buy was worth whatever it cost to buy it. I do not fully understand this decision. I understand the mathematics of it. I do not understand the part that makes someone choose to pay that cost. Well, this may be the thing about this species I am least prepared to explain. He stared at that line for a while. Then he added one more sentence. It is also the reason we lost. 3 weeks after the battle, Admiral Voss received an official communication from the Galactic Conclave. It was marked with formal diplomatic codes at the highest level of urgency, and its opening paragraph included 3 separate formal apologies for the Conclave's failure to act, for their recommendation to evacuate, and for what the communication carefully described as an insufficient appreciation of the human species' established defensive capabilities. It was, as diplomatic communications went, about as close to saying, we were wrong and we are very sorry, and also slightly afraid of you now. As formal galactic language allowed, the communication went on to invite humanity to attend an emergency session of the Conclave's Grand Assembly, at which Earth would be formally elevated to full senior membership. This was a status that typically took new member species between 200 and 500 years to achieve. Humanity had been a junior member for 68 years. The invitation also included, in a section that was clearly written carefully, an offer of additional defense cooperation, intelligence sharing, and a comprehensive review of the Conclave's existing security framework in light of recent events. Voss read the communication twice. Then she called Ambassador Ilara Osei, who was Earth's senior diplomatic representative to the Conclave, and read the relevant sections to her over a secure channel. Osei listened without interrupting. She was 61 years old, had spent 30 years in galactic diplomacy, and had spent most of those 30 years being talked down to by species who thought humanity was too young and too small to deserve real consideration. She listened to the communication, and when Voss finished reading, there was a short pause. When then Osei said that she would handle it, Voss believed her. 2 weeks later, Ambassador Osei walked into the Conclave's Grand Assembly Hall, accompanied by a small team of assistants and one UEDC military liaison. The hall was the most imposing room she had ever been in. A vast circular space designed to accommodate representatives from 200 different species, armed with tiered seating that rose up on every side, and a central speaking floor where the matter being discussed was projected in holographic detail above a platform. The hall was full. Every conclave member had sent its highest available representative. There were species present that rarely attended Grand Assembly sessions at all. The room was quieter than a conclave session usually was, and the quiet had a different quality than usual. Not the efficient, the structured quiet of a working political body, but the careful quiet of a room full of beings who were not entirely sure how to conduct themselves in the current situation. When Osei walked onto the central floor, the room went even quieter. The conclave's senior diplomat, a very old being named Harith, from a species called the Laurel, stood to deliver the formal opening. Harith began by reviewing the events of the past weeks for the record: the Krethnar advance, the battle, the surrender, or the containment of the surviving fleet. Each point presented clearly and accurately. Then Harith offered, on behalf of the full conclave, a formal apology to the human species for the inadequacy of the conclave's response and a formal recognition of what humanity had accomplished. Then Harith asked Ambassador Osei if she would like to speak. Osei stepped to the central platform. She looked up at the tiers of alien faces around him.